Chapter 15. Dear Holly. Vernon had actually written. Holly had been afraid he wouldn't, especially after the things she'd put in her last letter to him. My name has been cleared. Thanks. Vernon decided it was not a good idea to put too many details in his letter. Travers and Montague had a nasty habit of reading other people's mail. Holly's plan had worked brilliantly. Travers had gotten the nosebleed first and bolted out of the room in search of something to staunch the blood. Montague had bitten into the safe half and watched in confusion as Travers left. Vernon had taken a candy and nibbled on the safe side too, and after Travers had left, innocently asked, "You don't suppose she can really do it, curse people, do you?" "Nah," replied Montague casually. Then he popped the rest of the candy into his mouth, thus eating the other side. As soon as Montague left, Vernon quickly gathered up the pieces of candy and threw them in the garbage. He never said another word about Holly and her curse. The next day, both Montague and Travers received zeros for plagiarizing their book reports. Vernon, on the other hand, received high marks. The professor commented that Vernon's report displayed an enthusiasm and understanding of the plot and characters that could only be achieved by actually reading the book and completing the report in the spirit intended. Later on, it started to rain, and Montague had to take one of the younger students' umbrellas, as he had forgotten to bring his own. The umbrella he had taken just happened to be broken and wouldn't open right. Travers closed his own dripping umbrella too near his bag and got his papers all wet. Then the vending machine was out of their favorite snack. Little things kept going wrong for them. Each event was no big deal, but now, collectively, they seemed to take on a greater importance, and every time something else happened, Vernon noticed Travers and Montague would frown a bit and look worried. A week later, Travers and Montague had paid Vernon a visit in his room. "Look," said Travers finally, "you know we don't really believe in curses and stuff. But if we can clear your name, do you think you can get your sister to call off her curse thing?" "Yeah," agreed Montague. "Just thinking about her makes bad karma." "Of course," Vernon agreed. The next day he was called into the headmaster's office. 3 younger students had apparently walked into the headmaster's office earlier. The 3 confessed that on the very day and hour of the break-in, Vernon had been with them, using his knobbly stick, administering discipline and improving their physical health by supervising the 3 while they exercised. The students had been too ashamed to admit it earlier. It was all a total lie, of course, but the headmaster believed the tale. The 3 students received a detention for failing to come forward sooner, and Vernon got an apology. It wasn't quite the way Vernon expected to get his name cleared, but it would have to do. That night, both Travers and Montague watched while Vernon drafted a letter to Holly asking her to call off the curse. Vernon never sent it, of course. 2 days later, Vernon produced the red vinegar bottle, now carrying a label which read, "Lifting Curses. For best results, take 1 tablespoon exactly at midnight." Vernon explained to Travers and Montague that he had found the bottle in his drawer. It hadn't been there the night before. It had been in his bag. It must be in response to his letter to Holly. That night, at exactly midnight, Vernon had held the bottle while both Travers and Montague downed their tablespoon of liquid. Vernon had a hard time keeping a straight face while the 2 boys gagged on the stuff. But they were convinced the curse had been lifted after Montague received top marks for one of his papers the next day, also copied. And Travers found a wallet in a desk drawer containing 10 pounds. "I am looking for some new friends now." The best part, both boys now left Vernon alone, as if afraid his crazy sister might try something else. This left Vernon free to make some new friends, but, as his dad predicted, it was easier said than done. The other students were afraid of Vernon, afraid of his connection with Travers and Montague. Vernon had finally decided his best bet was a boy named Kenneth Perkins. Perkins had been in the infirmary the last few days. Travers and Montague had told Perkins to provide an alibi for Vernon along with the 3 other boys. Perkins had refused. Perkins never said a word about who had beaten him up. Vernon knew from past experience that Travers and Montague would continue harassing Perkins. They liked nothing better than a challenge. He also knew that no one else would probably go near Perkins now for fear of angering Travers and Montague. Kenneth Perkins was definitely in need of a friend. Perkins was the kind of person Holly had recommended. Maybe a visit to the infirmary and a heartfelt apology would be in order. Vernon already had at least one thing in common with Perkins. They had both refused to rat on Travers and Montague. They would also both be trying to keep their distance from Travers and Montague. Maybe that was enough to start a friendship. I don't know what to think about the rest of the stuff you wrote. We can talk about that later during the summer. I hope things are going well for you at school. Yours truly, Vernon. P.S. The disappearing ink is neat. Keep using it. Holly folded Vernon's letter and tucked it away in a drawer. It hadn't told her much, but at least he was writing. She'd have to think about what to write back. So much had gone on, but not much that she could write to Vernon about, as he didn't know anything about Hogwarts or its people. Lately there'd been a rash of injuries. Nothing big or noticeable, unless one was an empath. Julie Ross had accidentally bumped her head right before potions, and Alessa Moore, one of the Ravenclaw students, had limped in with a scraped knee. Neither injury was serious enough to require an immediate trip to the infirmary, so both students had continued to class as usual. To her dismay, Holly discovered that while humming helped her ignore emotions, it did nothing for physical pain. So she sat through class with a pounding headache and a knee that stung with every movement Alessa made. Holly did poorly on the morning quiz, and her potion exploded without warning, with the remains turning into a gooey mass that wasn't even worth grading. Before charms, Hugh Douglas slipped in the mud, scraping his knees and spraining his wrist while breaking the fall. So Holly had an aching wrist, stinging scratches, and a diminishing headache to contend with. To make matters worse, Shirley Ogg decided to sit near Holly. Shirley apparently had developed a mad crush on Anthony Richards in class. After Holly figured out Shirley was in love, it didn't take long to follow her amorous glances and determine which person Shirley had her eyes on. So whenever Holly quit humming, she found herself immersed in romantic daydreams. Students with various ailments seemed to attend every class. Keith Finnegan at Gryffindor ate too much for lunch and came in herbology with a stomachache. Connor Fitzpatrick, another Gryffindor, came to class feeling incredibly hungry. Sylvia Mackenzie had a toothache. Kelly Davies of Ravenclaw stubbed her toe before History of Magic class. Holly felt every malady. And it wasn't just one day. All week, students came to class with various sprained ankles, stubbed toes, cuts, bruises, scratches, and headaches. While any one of them was annoying, combined, Holly sometimes felt so distracted she could no longer concentrate on schoolwork within the classroom. The weekend came as a welcome relief from all the various aches and pains she had encountered during class. Holly spent as much time as possible in the dorms with Sasha on her lap, catching up on lost work. She ate her meals late and even chose to miss the latest Quidditch match, fearing the possible aches and pains it might bring. "Are you coming?" Becky said impatiently. Holly sighed and picked up her things. Reluctantly, she said goodbye to Sasha and followed Becky out the door. She hoped this week would be better than last, with less student injuries. Who knew there would come a time when she would welcome the standard onslaught of student emotions without accompanying pain? The moment Holly stepped into potions, she knew it would be another rough week. 2 of the Ravenclaw students had headaches, and Susan seemed to have sprained her wrist and accidentally squashed 2 crickets in her bag. "I'm sorry," whispered Susan, knowing that Holly could feel the sprain. Holly could tell the loss of the crickets bothered her more than the pain of her wrist. "But my feet just slid out from under me and my books went flying and I couldn't help myself." Holly nodded sympathetically, knowing Susan meant every word. Accidents do happen, but they'd been happening so frequently lately. Holly's potion again had to be tossed in the garbage. Layla came over to Holly while they were cleaning up. Layla had a huge bump on her forehead and a headache to match. It hurt to stand next to her. "Did you notice all the recent injuries?" she asked Holly conversationally. Yes, I did," replied Holly, trying hard to ignore her now pounding headache. "Did you notice that they only happen to first-year students, and only students right before they attend class with Hufflepuffs?" Layla's words chilled Holly to the bone. No, she hadn't noticed that. She'd been too distracted by all the pain. The Slytherins know you're an empath, concluded Layla, saying the words Holly had dreaded to hear all year. Layla wiped her cauldron dry, turned to leave, and then added, "We thought you should know." "Thank you," whispered Holly distractedly, stunned by what Layla had said. Then Holly called out, "Layla?" Layla turned and looked at Holly expectantly. "I am so very sorry," Holly added. Holly suddenly realized that Layla's bump might never have happened were it not for her. Holly couldn't stop the tears from streaming down her face. Layla nodded and walked off. "What's wrong?" asked Becky as they hurried to Charms. She could tell Holly was upset. "The Slytherins know I'm an empath. That's why everyone keeps on having accidents." "What?" exclaimed Mark, listening in. "How did that happen? Wouldn't you have known?" How indeed? Holly was wondering that very thing. She used to be able to tell when the Slytherins were planning something at meal times. Except without Sasha, Holly had avoided eating with the group as a whole. The only other time she had regular contact with the Slytherins was during classes. Surely she would have noticed something then. Except... "I've been avoiding the Slytherins at meal times, and Shirley has had this horrible crush on Anthony, so whenever I'm not humming in class near the Slytherins, I can't take my mind off Anthony," Holly confessed. "I bet she's taken a love potion," said Mark angrily. "What can we do?" worried Becky. "The only thing we can do," replied Mark. "We've got to warn everyone. The Slytherins must be involved somehow in causing all the accidents. If we all keep on the lookout, we might be able to better avoid them." "Well," began Holly, "the Ravenclaws already know. They told me. I'll tell my cousins and they'll warn all the Gryffindors, and we can pass the word on to the rest of the Hufflepuffs." "What kind of magic causes accidents?" inquired Becky. "I don't know," replied Mark. "I'll ask Roland and Stephen at lunch." By this time they had reached their Charms classroom. Holly sat as far away as possible from Shirley, but Anthony, who was sitting nearer to Holly, got up and traded seats with Shirley. Shirley had this dreamy look on her skinny face and oozed affection. "Oh, get a life," muttered Holly darkly, and turned her attention to her work. Holly waited with Becky outside the great hall so she could catch one of her cousins coming to lunch. James came down first with some of his friends. He stopped when he saw Holly and Becky. Telling his friends to go on without him, he came over to Holly. "Hiya, cuz," he said affectionately. A week of detention together did wonders for strengthening family ties. "What's up?" Holly quickly told James about all the accidents and how the Ravenclaws thought it was a Slytherin attempt to get at her. James frowned as she spoke. Both Albus and Rose had commented on the recent number of injuries and ailments among the first years. They hadn't connected it with Holly, but it made sense. "Thanks for letting me know," he told Holly. "We'll take care of it from our end." Then, seeing Holly's stricken face, he added encouragingly, "Hey, it'll be okay. Don't worry about it." "But all those people are getting injured because of me," she whispered guiltily. James took her by the shoulder and looked her in the eyes. "This is not your fault," he assured her. "You did not do this. Do not take the blame for someone else's actions. And don't you try to cut classes until we get things sorted," he commanded. "Understand?" Holly reluctantly nodded. Skipping classes had sounded rather nice. "Believe me," he continued, "if you were not around, the Slytherins would find someone else to harass. It's just the way they are." James released her. "Now," he said, smiling, "I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. What say you we both get inside and have a bite to eat?" Holly looked inside the great hall. She was hungry, but she didn't dare. "It must be pretty difficult to have to eat in a rush, late every day after everyone else has eaten," he added gently. "I was thinking that if you ate with the rest of us, you would get full the same time as everyone else, and you wouldn't have to worry about starving or overstuffing yourself." Holly looked at James in astonishment. "How did you—" She stopped. Of course, James would have noticed she hadn't been eating with the rest of the students, and, knowing she was an empath, would have eventually figured out the reason why. "It's only for one meal," he added convincingly. "It wouldn't hurt to try," encouraged Becky. "If it doesn't work, then we can go back to eating our meals the other way." So Holly, Becky, and James entered the great hall for lunch. Surprisingly, the meal did not turn out as bad as Holly expected. As James predicted, everyone, including Holly, was hungry and got full at about the same time. Of course, Holly felt the loud onslaught of emotions emanating from a crowd of students. But by concentrating on the food and humming when she could, Holly managed to keep all the other emotions to a dull roar in the background. For a short time, Holly decided to risk the full impact of the emotions to see what she could sense. She closed her eyes and stopped humming. The emotions of the room were familiar now, just magnified. Except there was a new one, a strong sense of satisfaction. Holly turned her head towards the source and opened her eyes. She found herself looking at the Slytherin table. Paige Crowley, Richard's girlfriend with the long black hair, looked up and caught Holly looking their way. She smiled at Holly. The smile gave Holly shivers. The Hufflepuffs called a quick house meeting for all first years immediately after lunch and before herbology. Ben and Gwen made the students go through everything in his or her pack and remove anything that did not look familiar. Several of the students found they had small polished stones in their bags. Roland looked at the stones with interest without touching them. "Could be some sort of jinx stone," he pronounced after studying them. "We can't tell for sure if the jinx is already used up." Using his wand, he pushed all the unfamiliar items carefully in a bag for removal. "I'll have Professor Lovegood come by and take a look at these after her classes. Maybe she can tell what they are." "You're not going to take them to her?" asked Hugh Douglas. "Don't dare," replied Roland. "They should be harmless enough if the jinx is used up. But if it hasn't, then whoever carries the bag could be in for a huge accident." The students were then instructed to leave their bags in the dorm when eating and check them daily. Hopefully, this would ensure any new, possibly jinxed items that might get slipped in amongst their things would be quickly identified and removed. They were reminded to always travel in groups and keep a sharp lookout for Slytherins, especially Slytherins in secluded locations. Then they were all sent to class before they got late. For once, everyone arrived accident-free. Rose came over to Holly during class while they were repotting the Octopodum viper plant. It was a carnivorous plant used in many antitoxin potions. Its many thorny vines would wrap around a living creature and squeeze. The thorns would pierce the flesh and inject poisonous venom. These plants were still quite young, scarce 10 centimeters tall. Their thorns were tiny and their venom was not yet poisonous. Still, the students all wore heavy gloves while repotting. The tiny stems curled around wrists and fingers and had to be carefully peeled off so as to not damage the plants. "James told us what was happening," she began, putting down the plant she had just finished repotting. "We're so sorry. How are you doing?" "Okay, I guess," replied Holly, pulling off an aggressive stem from her finger. She still felt guilty about everything, but at least none of the Gryffindors had arrived with injuries, and nobody seemed to be blaming her. "They found a bunch of jinx stones in her bags, and that was probably causing the accident," she added. "Ours, too," agreed Rose, preparing a pot with dirt for her next plant. "Of course, removing the stones probably won't stop all the accidents. No doubt the Slytherins will try something else. We'll just have to watch out." Holly was pleased to note Layla appeared in the History of Magic class without the bumps or headaches. At least the Slytherin damage hadn't been lasting. Holly greeted Layla with a smile. "Thanks for the warning," she said to Layla. "We found a whole bunch of jinx stones in our bags." Holly absently scratched her leg while she talked. Layla nodded in acknowledgement and then commented, "I think you may all want to pay a visit to Madame Pomfrey before you return to the dorms. Cassandra said she saw some suspicious-looking Slytherins out by the herbology pathways." Layla looked down pointedly at Holly's legs and then around at the rest of the room. Holly followed her gaze and looked too. With a start, she realized all the Hufflepuff students were scratching their legs. Well, that was one way to stay awake in Professor Ben's class. "Tasmanian sand flea bites," announced Madame Pomfrey after all the Hufflepuffs had made it to the infirmary. "Nothing a little anti-itch lotion won't take care of in a jiffy. Mind you, Hagrid will have to station several hairy toads along the path to eat them up fast, or the whole school will be infested with them." "It's the Slytherins that did it," accused Holly while she rubbed in the lotion. "Can't we do something about them?" "Oh? And what evidence do you have?" "Well," began Holly, "nothing, really. But I can feel—" "Miss Wycliffe," interrupted Madame Pomfrey, "as useful as your empathic abilities are, they cannot be used as evidence. A skilled wizard can manipulate what you feel and sense, rendering it totally false. You cannot count on your senses alone. It might interest you to know," she added, putting away the lotion, "that your cousin Harry Potter once passed out during class and woke up screaming, convinced he knew something important. When I saw him, he was frantically looking for Professor McGonagall. When he couldn't find her, he raced off, and the next thing I heard, Potter had left the campus. It was a foolish thing for him to do," she added, "especially as there was no safer place for him than Hogwarts. Worse, he convinced his friends to go with him, and they walked straight into the waiting hands of the Death Eaters. It had all been some sort of a trick engineered by you-know-who. Potter darn near got himself and everyone else killed. I had quite a time in the infirmary that night dealing with all their injuries." "So what happened? Why did he pass out?" asked Holly with interest. "No one knows," replied Madame Pomfrey. "Leastways, no one that ever said. You-know-who couldn't have cast a spell on him while he was at Hogwarts, especially not in a classroom like that." "What made him so sure?" "There's no telling," replied Madame Pomfrey. "But for you-know-who to have Potter so completely fooled when he didn't have any kind of contact with the boy was an impressive piece of manipulation. You just can't trust your senses alone." "Madame Pomfrey," asked Holly, changing the subject, "have you heard from that other empath about blocking?" "Not yet," she replied briskly. "I'll let you know when I do. Now, your friends are waiting outside, so off you go," she said, shooing Holly out the door. The next day in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, Professor Lovegood paired the students to practice the hexes they had studied. One student was to practice the hex, and the other had to defend against it, using either Protegeo or Expelliarmus. Hexes, while annoying, didn't physically hurt someone once cast. Holly found herself paired off against Anthony Richards. He smiled when they faced off. "I've got a really great hex picked out for you," he said. "Vinculus! Expelliarmus!" shouted Holly when Richards started to speak. Richards' wand went clattering off and hit Susan Braesbury. Holly winced when she felt it strike her. "Oops," said Richards, following the wand's path without concern. "Did that hurt?" He walked over, collected his wand, and returned. "Shall we try again?" "Why?" asked Holly while raising her wand. "Why do you hate me so?" "You're a filthy mudblood, muggle-born and a Potter. Mudbloods have no business at Hogwarts. Densuego!" "Protegeo!" shouted Holly, again blocking the spell. But this time the wand didn't fly out of Richard's hand. "Potters always get special treatment just because they're Potters," Richard added coldly. "You've been getting preferred treatment from the very first day you arrived. Wordossuegus!" Holly stared at Richards in amazement, barely getting her shield up in time. That which she had needed for survival, no doubt even her late arrival, had appeared like preferential treatment to Richards. "But to go to such length for so long!" "You embarrassed me that first day," he replied, "and lost us house points. I never forget. Tarantelegra!" he shouted, but Holly was ready. "Protegeo!" Richard's spell again bounced off her shield harmlessly. There was some advantage to being an empath. Holly could always tell when a spell was about to be cast. Then it was the time for the two to switch off. It was Holly's turn to cast the hexes. The two of them raised their wands. In previous wandwork assignments, the Hufflepuffs had faced off against each other. Holly didn't want to jinx or hex her friends at Hufflepuff, even only for practice. She had planned to use Expelliarmus against her friends. Holly didn't realize she'd be asked to try her skills against a Slytherin, and especially didn't anticipate facing off against Richards. Listening to Richards, Holly realized she could try to explain that the so-called special treatment had been a necessity, but she could never not be a Potter or Muggle-born. Trying to be nice to Richards would gain her nothing. "Tarantelegra!" Holly shouted. Being an empath meant she could also tell when the other person wasn't ready to cast his or her spell. Unfortunately, Holly had no idea what the curse was. It had sounded good when Richards said it. As she expected, her spell caught Richards off guard and hit him with full force. His legs started to wobble and fly out from under him. He landed with a loud crash. Holly's legs also wobbled, flew out from under her, and she fell. Her wand went flying and her legs jerked about uncontrollably. Holly quickly grabbed her legs, bending them at the knees and holding them tight, humming loudly, trying to focus, all the while reminding herself that she wasn't the one with the curse. It was all she could do to not let go of her legs. Richards had not lost grasp of his wand, but he could not control leg movement with one hand. so his legs flailed about every which way. Everyone stopped what they were doing and gathered around to watch. Professor Lovegood came over and studied the two. Finally she spoke. Dimly Holly heard her calm words over Holly's frantic humming. "That was a poor selection of a curse, Miss Wycliffe, knowing its possible side effects," Professor Lovegood began. "That makes me think you did not know the nature of the curse you cast, which is not surprising, as it was not on the list you were assigned to review. You should never cast a curse without first knowing its nature," she continued serenely. "It might backfire. 5 points from Hufflepuff." Then Professor Lovegood turned her attention to Richards. "Well?" she asked, looking at him expectantly. He looked at her in confusion, his legs flying every which way. "You have your wand. Why haven't you performed the counter to this curse?" His face reddened. "I don't know the counter," he confessed, his legs still flailing about uncontrollably. "I believe the assignment was to learn the spells and their counters. Both are equally important. You may find yourself in a position where you have to use a counter. You should know the counter of every spell you use. Had you spent your time preparing for class instead of planning student harassment, you would know how to counter this spell easily. 5 points from Slytherin." She looked around the ring of students. "Who knows the counter to the spell?" Mark raised his hand hesitantly. It hadn't been on the list to study, but he had done extra reading, as usual, and recognized the spell. "Mr. Owens, would you please cast the counter?" Mark stepped forward. He pointed his wand at Richard's legs and said firmly, "Finite." The spell was lifted. Richard's legs fell still. Holly no longer had to clutch hers, but she remained on the floor and buried her head in her lap, too embarrassed to look up. "Very good, Mr. Owens. 5 points for Hufflepuff." "I think that is enough practice for today," said Professor Lovegood, looking around the room. All the standing students turned quickly to leave. As the room emptied, Richards got up and started to leave. "One more thing, Mr. Richards," said Professor Lovegood calmly. Richards froze in place, not turning to look at her. "Your efforts at spell casting were admirable, but serve only to demonstrate what you should have realized had you been more thorough in your research. It is nearly impossible to win a wizard's duel against an empath. For this reason, I shall be asking Miss Wycliffe to not participate further in student-against-student wand work. I assure you this is not a special treatment accorded her because she is a Potter or because she has Muggle parents, but because it would be unfair to ask other students, such as you, to practice against her. Wouldn't you agree?" Richards turned very pale at her words and clenched his fist, but said nothing. "You may go now," she said, dismissing him. Richards walked stiffly out of the room. Holly remained seated on the floor with her head tucked in her lap. She had refused to leave with Becky and the other Hufflepuffs. With the room now empty, she lifted her head and turned her tear-streaked face to Professor Lovegood. "Those curses, hexes, and jinx are hateful," she exploded. "Giving people bat ears, warts, long teeth, fat noses, ballooning body parts, spidery crawling hair. I couldn't do that to my friends, not even in practice. I couldn't embarrass them that way. I couldn't even do it to Holly broke off and sobbed some more. "So I tried the spell I didn't know." Professor Lovegood squatted down next to Holly. "You won't have to worry about doing that to your friends any more," she said gently while helping Holly up, "or your enemies. But you still have to learn all the spells and their counters, just in case. You will be thoroughly tested on your knowledge of them." Holly nodded tearfully. "And you should never, ever cast an unfamiliar spell." Professor Lovegood handed Holly a tissue to wipe her face and walked her to the door of the practice room. Becky and Mark sat outside waiting for her. Becky handed Holly's wand back to her. "There's a book on my shelf you might find of interest," continued Professor Lovegood conversationally. She pointed her wand to the back wall. "Accio," she said, and a slender, bright yellow book dotted with hot pink flowers and chartreuse green leaves floated across the room to her. She handed the book to Holly. Holly looked at it. The title was Hexing with Love, Hexes People Won't Want Removed, by Amelia Pacifica. She opened the book and looked at the table of contents. Subject headings included hair, curling, straightening, lengthening, removing gray, coloring, adding highlights. Teeth, whitening, brightening, straightening, repairing. Skin, removing scars, removing warts, anti-acne, wrinkle removal. adornment. Moving tattoos, beauty spots, living hair clips, butterflies and dragons, flowers and leaves and other plants. Holly closed the book carefully. Yes, I think I would like reading this book very much, she said to Professor Lovegood. May I borrow it? Professor Lovegood nodded, smiling. Thank you, Holly said, stowing the book in her bag. Then the three left together for their next class.